Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're joined today here in the Left of Black studios in the John Hope Franklin Center with Professor Vanessa Valdés. She is the author of the new book, Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. She's also the author of Ocean's Daughters, The Search for Womanhood in the Americas, and also the editor of Let the Spirit Speak, Cultural Journeys Through the African Diaspora, all published by the State University of New York Press. She is also Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the City College of New York. How are you doing today?
I'm good.
Thank you for joining us here at Left of Black.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, truly.
There is perhaps no more well-known figure in African American arts and letters that folks don't quite fully understand. Than Arturo Schomburg, right? And so many of us just know him as Arthur Schomburg,
right?
Because of the various ways he kind of rebranded himself over the course of his life. Yeah. We know that there's a giant research center and library that's been run by some pretty spectacular people that sits on 135th Street in Harlem, named after him. How did you come to Schomburg?
So I was in college and taking my first U.S. Latino Lit class. So, you know, I was an English major, thought I knew everything. It was all like Chaucer and Milton and Morrison and Wright. And then I took this class and it blew my mind because it was the first time that I had seen my peoples in literature. And then that professor mentions that there's this place called the Schomburg Center that focused completely on the Black experience. Okay. And then he mentions that he was a Puerto Rican man. What are you talking about? Like, what do you mean? And so for me, it was as a bookworm, as a child of New York City, for me, I was like, you know, I think of the New York Public Library as like the Lions in 42nd Street. Right. So I had no idea of the research centers. I had no idea of it. And as you say, you know, for a lot of people, for a lot of the Puerto Ricans in particular, the fact that Schomburg, there's a sense of pride of like, for some, like Schomburg is Puerto Rican, and that's where it ends, right? And so, for me, I mean, quite frankly, in this moment where you see Afro-Latinidad and questions of Afro-Latinx identity coming up, this was, you know, Schomburg is like the main figure in terms of elusiveness, right? As you say, like, people may know him by name or know the library, and that's it.
And even the name they're trying to process. What kind of name is Schomburg for a Puerto Rican? Right?
Well, and here's the thing, right? So you go like, what kind of name is Schomburg for a Black man?
Right.
Forget the Puerto Ricanness.
Right.
Then you throw in the Puerto Ricanness, and then it's kind of like, well, now we're just complicating things. Like, what is this? And so that was part of it, right? That was part of my insistence on, you know, when I spoke to the press about the cover, I was like, we have to put this picture on the cover. Like,
we have to know what he looks like.
Yeah, you know, and then they have to, so then even, because then that challenges everybody, right? Because for Puerto Ricans who are kind of like, we didn't know, then it's like, maybe you weren't expecting that face, right? To go with that name, right? And so there's, I mean, it's so, he represents so much and troubles so many notions of what we think of, whether it's Puerto Ricanness, why were Germans in Puerto Rico? Like, who was his daddy? Who was it? I mean, there's so much.
Right. I mean, one of the chapters in the book, you literally talk about how his image is circulated, right? Yeah. And what he's trying to project, and there's not a whole lot of photographs of him. So it's like the same, it seems like the same dozen photographs that we've all seen over the course of the years, but you also talk about him as kind of a transgressive figure, particularly in that historical moment, because he, you know, there's pressures to choose.
Absolutely.
Right? Are you Black? Are you African American? Or are you Puerto Rican? And he refuses to. Right. I mean, he's actually thinking about, and you know, hence the title of your book, Diasporic Blackness, right? He's thinking in that context before a lot of folks are ready to get on board to think about it in that way.
Absolutely, and I think, so, you know, using the parlance of the day, right? He identifies as a Negro, right? That's who he is. Now, if we think about this man as a man who's at the very least bilingual, right? Having been born and raised in Puerto Rico, can read French. So when he's using the word Negro, he's also cognizant of the word negro, right? So there's a kind of already there, the multiplicity. There was no pushback with regards to, I think one of the reasons that he gets criticized and why he's been outside of Puerto Rican historiography is because a lot of people they go to figures like Jesus Colón and Bernardo Vega, who arrive in New York 1916, 1917, and they write in Spanish, they stay within the enclave, that's it. And here comes, so that's part of the pushback with Schomburg, is that, well, he's communicating in English, writing in English, and Spanish if you go into his archive, but people don't know that, right? And yeah, so that kind of, there's this idea that he turns his back on Puerto Ricans by claiming affinity for African Americans, right? But by the same token, I think part of that also is how we flatten out the Harlem Renaissance, because New York City has always been a site of diasporic blackness, right? Not just, when we talk about Anglophone, Caribbean peoples, African Americans. So we have U.S. black, peoples from like the British colonies at the time, people from the Spanish colonies at the time, right? So that's what's happening, and that's the piece that really hasn't been looked at up until this moment, last decade or so, is what's the role of black Cubans and black Puerto Ricans, of which he's a part of that community. Because
we really don't think about Schomburg until the 20th century. We don't think about who he is prior, in the late 19th century. And one of the more illuminating things for me was that, this is someone who had a relationship with Jose Marti.
Yes, yeah.
So talk a little bit about that relationship.
Well, so part of this, so in the introduction, I talk about how, this tension, right? And it's kind of like, why is he elusive, right? So why is this, it's as if his Puerto Ricanness is incidental, right? For a lot of people. This idea of like, meh, okay, and we're just gonna glance over that. We're gonna rush into the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so the man was born in 1874. So we're talking about, we're gonna start his life when he's about 50? You're like, what did he do prior, right? So to me, that was, that called my attention. And then you just start looking at the dates and go, okay, well, he arrives in 1891 in New York City. Most Puerto Rican historiography in New York begins, as I said, 1916. So that means that he's already living there all that time prior to that, so why don't we push it back? And he's not the only one, right? And I mentioned a couple of other figures. So the fact that his Puerto Ricanness was incidental for some, and then for other people, it's kind of, like, they don't know how he's doing this. So for me, it was really incredibly important to trace what was he doing when he was in New York, right? Because this sense of like betrayal of Puerto Ricanness versus betrayal of Puerto Ricanness on one side, incidental on the other side. Okay, and it's like, no, he's in the fight for Cuban independence and Puerto Rican independence, which is not a historical episode that we really learn in many schools in the United States.
We only think about Puerto Rico in the context of its relationship with the United States. Don't think about it in terms of Spain.
And so there's, and that again goes to the heart of, again, Afro-Latinidad in general, right? And just Spanish-speaking populations in general, right? I mean, there's so much that we don't think about, right? Like we may think, for example, about how half this country was Mexico at some point, but it's kind of a blip, right? We don't think about, okay, so Columbus, we know 1492 and the three ships. Where does he land, right? And so for Dominicans, they're very proud that Columbus lands on that island. Okay, so then what happens between then and the Pilgrims? Nothing? You know what I mean? And so again, it's what he does, and what examining him and his life does is it opens up all these questions, including what we are taught, how we are taught to think about history in this country, because even between the Mayflower and the Pilgrims and Jamestown in Virginia, right? It's like, so there was Spanish-speaking peoples on this continent for 100 years prior to. So then we talk about like, the founding, again, we get history and bits and pieces in this country. So the founding of St. Augustine, right? It's like, well, who founded it? It's like, oh yeah, well, we don't really want to talk about that.
And it complicates,
And the thing is, the way that we replicate, our imperial powers, like the fact that we're speaking English in this moment, and then of course we're gonna learn about English. So we're not at all gonna learn about Spanish presence. That's not to say, because folks go, I love Twitter, because you'll see people go like, miss me with, this colonizer's within that colonizer. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that like, woohoo, like I'm not flying like the Spanish flag at this moment. But what I'm saying is, how does our understanding of this land change if we really take into account those 100 years that are missing? At least from 1492 to 1619. You know, like how does, if we are actually examining those accounts of colonization, of settler colonialism, of those treatments of enslaved peoples, because the enslaved peoples didn't start in the 17th century. They were coming with the conquistadores.
Right.
So then what was slavery like for them, you know? And not to replicate Tannenbaum's thesis, which has since been, you know, proven false, of like, no, it was a smoother kind of slave. No, it was slavery. Like these folks were enslaved, period. But, you know, when we think about, for example, the founding of Los Angeles, like Los Angeles was founded by mulatto families, like by Afro-Mexicans.
Right.
How does that change how we think about that city?
Right.
You know, how we think about any of these places, you know? And so that's what Schomburg does. That's Schomburg's mission, is accumulating all of these documents to say, hey, our histories don't start in enslavement. Our histories go beyond enslavement. Black excellence is not just encapsulated by the Harlem Renaissance.
Right,
you know?
it's broader than that.
Yeah.
And yet he understood how to be a striver in
Absolutely.
Harlem. So he's a Freemason, a
Yes.
Black Freemason.
Yes.
He's working with the NAACP, the Urban League. He's working with organizations of Black scholars and historians, trying to pull those histories together. What's that balancing act like for him?
So again, in every space that he's walking into, he's always talking about Spanish-speaking peoples. And that is, he's confronting peoples. And that's, my thesis is that he's expanding notions of Blackness, because
Right.
you have to include folks that are below the Rio Grande, right?
Right.
And so for him, even being a Freemason, right? So he is initiated soon after he comes into New York into an Afro-Cuban lodge. And so that lodge in Brooklyn is by Black Cubans, and what happens is that the population changes, and that in of itself brings up the question of what happens to those Black Cubans. Because when we think about passing in this country,
Right.
we often think Black to white.
Right.
We don't think about like different ethnicities passing into Blackness.
Into Blackness, right?
Right? And so that's what happens, is that you have Afro-Cuban populations who are moving away and moving into different spaces. And so what he does is he is one of a critical figure in recruiting folks from Anglophone Caribbean peoples, because you have people from Barbados and Jamaica coming into those spaces. And so even there he's translating, right? And so again, when we talk about his role within the Harlem Renaissance, it's, yes, he's friends, you know, he's communicating with, but really friends with Charles Johnson, for
Right.
example.
Right.
But also, you know, he's friends with Claude McKay. He's friends, Marcus Garvey's a Mason. So like, he's
Right.
hobnobbing with all these folks.
Introduces him to Black elite, right?
Yeah,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
so part of that also is, how does this man, who, as far as we know, has a secondary education, right?
Right, it's autodidact.
Right, and so how is he like, you know, ascending the social ladder? And again, part of, you know, I think the tensions with him in all different realms is he doesn't have these papers, right? He doesn't have a PhD, right? So for all intents and purposes, why is he hobnobbing with, you know, Du Bois and
Right.
Johnson, right? And then, but by the same token, like why he was mentored by Jose Marti, right? And he's so in terms of just Antillean liberation, Cuban liberation, when I tell folks that, like the Cubans are like, what? Right, this Black man is right there, and he is not the only one.
Right.
And so it's really interesting, because when we talk about his most famous essay, of course, is The Negro Digs Up His Past. And one of the points that he makes there is that one of the ways that you can destroy a community is by singling out folks and naming them exceptional. And that is what has happened to him, right? Because people think, oh, was he the only, right, in all of these realms? He was the only in terms of educational like at a certain level, right? But when he's dealing with the Freemasons and the men who mentored him, there were a number of Black men who were self-taught because they couldn't get into these schools.
The schools, right.
Right? These are segregated times. And so he's not the only in that respect.
Right.
When he's with Afro-Cuban men, and in particular, and Afro-Puerto Rican men, who are forming groups and educating each other, right? Jose Marti co-founds the Cuban Revolutionary Party with Rafael Serra, who is a Black man who found papers in Cuba, comes to New York, is finding papers, is founding schools, because it's all about like, we have to educate ourselves and
Right.
educate each other in order to be good citizens and then participate in this democracy.
Right.
And so part of why I did this research the way that I did it was to ground him in all of these different realms and to say again, like, these are all groups of peoples who are doing this, right? He is a part of Cubans, like, accumulating information, and Puerto Ricans accumulating information and educating each other. Then he's within the Black bibliophile circles as well. You know, he's with the folks who are establishing, like, Moreland Spingarn in DC. Like, he knows, like, who the folks are in DC, in Philly, that Northeast corridor. He is in constant communication with them. And so he's never by himself. It's just that it's only specialists that focus on one aspect
of his career. Yeah. You're watching Left of Black. My name is Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Vanessa Valdés, who's Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the City College of New York. She's the author of Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. When I first got introduced to Schomburg, the man, the first thing that struck out to me is that he's described as a bibliophile. And I'm like, what the hell is a bibliophile? Right. And you have to ask, what is it about this, what we might think of as nominally uneducated Black man from Puerto Rico who decides to collect stuff, right? And we talk all the time about archives and things like that as scholars, but we rarely consider Black folks who just collect shit. Right. You know, for the sake of collecting shit, right? We don't think that those are actually important archives. But yet, he's collecting all this stuff, and the Carnegie Corporation pays $10,000 in 1926, right? I can't even imagine what that looks like on, you know, in a 2018 context, to buy all of his papers for the New York Public Library, right? And what becomes the nascent version of the Schomburg Center. That's an amazing story. Yes. In and of itself, right? And it gives us reason to pause for lots of reasons. Just like folks can't wrap their head around the role that the Ford Foundation played in founding Black studies as we know it today, right? To think that there would be no Schomburg Center as we know it without the Carnegie Foundation being involved in that process. What were folks thinking, you know, when they saw this transaction? And when they began to actually get into what that archive represented. So by the time they come into it, we're talking 1926, he is already well known, right, as the collector. He is the most well known, one, because of his Freemason activities, right? So within the Freemason circles, even there he's collecting. He becomes the librarian of his lodge, right? So he's doing that. So he's he in that world is the weird Black Puerto Rican dude who got all this shit. He is. Right. He is. And so the thing is, and the story is that apparently his wife at some point looks at him and says, come on, Pa. Like, we have to make room because he's a hoarder. Yes, he truly is. I mean, the thing is that people were going out to his house. Here's who he was by 1926. You have Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, other young writers are going out to his house to see his stuff. He also has a relationship with Ernestine Rose, who's the librarian at the time at the 135th Street branch. And he's already been there for years. And that 135th Street branch, for the audience who doesn't know, right, is the precursor to the Schomburg, right? Yes. It really is like a little hole in the wall, right, on 135th Street. Yeah, and so she comes up from the Lower East Side. She served as the librarian in the Seward branch down there, and for her, public libraries serve a purpose to the community, right? That's what they're supposed to do. And so the Carnegie Corporation had been funding public libraries. And so for example, down in the Lower East Side, there was a Jewish population, and so she's in charge of or she starts the accumulation of the collection of materials that will best serve that population. She moves up to Harlem. She looks, or they move her up to Harlem, and she goes, okay, here's the populations here, right? And so they have a what is called the Negro Committee, right? Because they want to have a Negro collection of literature and prints. Right. And here's Mr. Schomburg. And they're like, okay, so he's automatically put on the committee, right? As is, I believe, Charles S. Johnson is on there. Again, the luminaries that are working there, because Charles S. Johnson
prior to moving down to Fisk in 1928, of course, he's the editor at the National Urban League, right? And the editor of Opportunity magazine. So you have him, you have Du Bois. This is really the center.
Right. Garvey's still.
Yeah, he's still around. Yeah, and so there's that. That's the seed of the conversation. Is Schomburg had already been lending stuff to the 135th Street branch. Okay. Schomburg had already he organized an exhibit about Haiti in 1924 that was at the 42nd Street branch as well. So this is the moment when the U.S. military has occupied Haiti. So they've been. That starts in 1915. So already Haiti is under occupation for 8 years, as is the Dominican Republic, right? So this is, again, one way of combating perceptions about Haiti that are throughout the U.S. media at the time. And also, Haiti is incredibly important for Black internationalists at that moment in terms of like the revolution.
And I mean, because you mentioned in the book that he was really big on collections and exhibitions that were thematic, right, as a way to bring people to them.
Yeah, and so that was one. Again, he is so relevant because there's so many questions that we can be continuing to ask ourselves today. For example, questions of access, right? Questions of what is scholarly, right? And so here's a man here's this hoarder who has all this stuff and says, okay, he's the one that has that memory that says, yep, I'm going to put all this out now, boom, and that's scholarship, right? And so he's curating different experiences, and that garners that kind of attention. And yet, so then people go, wait a second, well, they kind of like push back, right? Well, he didn't have his papers, but the folks who knew that he had that kind, knew that he knew what he was talking about, knew that he had that kind of brain, and so they always seated him that position. Like, yes, he is the one who knows that much about all of this.
So one of the parts of his life that I did not know about until I read your book, and until you came down here to Duke, you mentioned his relationship with Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson goes to Fisk. Charles Johnson, I imagine, gets down to Fisk and looks at their collection and is like, we need to bring Schomburg down here to get our stuff in order. Yeah. So he's the curator of the Negro collection at Fisk from 1931 to 32. It's like, that's a part of his story that I had never heard before.
Because no one's talking. I mean, there's so much, right? So part of that, and again, for me, what's really interesting, born in New York City, New Yorican, okay, I go to Vanderbilt University, right, for my graduate degree. So I am unwittingly following this man's footsteps without realizing it until later, right? Because I know where I know where Fisk is. I know what that is, and that relationship.
I mean, John Hope Franklin's an undergraduate at Fisk at that time. I mean, that's.
So this is why, I mean, that's why it's. I cannot even tell you, like, not a full circle moments for, like, to be in this building on this moment with you talking about this particular subject. So. Charles Johnson gets to Fisk in 1928. He leaves the Urban League because he feels that his time, his projects, things are changing, right? So economically, things are changing. The Harlem Renaissance is already changed. Like late 20s already, we're heading into.
So he's out, right? He's
out. And so Fisk has a new president, Thomas Elsa Jones, 1926. He comes into play. And what they do together is they want to make Fisk the premier historically Black college. That's not the designation used at the time. They wanted it to be the premier Negro school. So again, Carnegie Corporation and the Rosenwald Fund are that's what they're doing. They are funding schools right throughout the South. And part of that is libraries, and part of that is education, and part of it is how do you educate a Black population that has not yet been brought into the folds, right? This is, of course, post Plessy v. Ferguson, Jim Crow is like rampant, right? And so this is a way to combat that, right? And so you have Schomburg in 1929, he retires in 29 from his job because he's doing all this while he's employed. Like he has a full-time job, and he's a Freemason, and he's doing X, Y, and Z. And so you have the President Jones at the time is in communication with him about acquiring books to develop the collection. So then that begins the conversation of how they're going to do this. Fisk gets a grant for almost $500,000 to build a new library. And so part of that is we need to really expand our collections. They want to be the premier school in terms, particularly in education.
Right, premier research center. Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so Schomburg is key to that. So you have Charles Johnson saying, well, maybe perhaps can we bring him in? Like, can we bring him down here, right? Because while he's in New York, he's still working on their behalf. Like the president is reimbursing his costs in terms of, he's assessing different collections, you know, on behalf of Fisk University. And so it is very much, and even in that realm, there's correspondence where he tells a collector, he said, you know, I'm sorry, Fisk already has these books. And because Fisk had books that, like many universities colleges at the time, that was centered on the U.S. Black experience and on slavery. And even then, he's diversifying their collection. And so he's still looking at books, he's still collecting in the same way that he's collecting personally, i.e. Books beyond enslavement and books about Black men and women and children throughout the Americas. And so by the time his time is up at Fisk and he goes back to New York, they have almost 4,000 books about the global Black experience. And that is what Fisk becomes, that collection becomes known for, is beyond, there was communication with the YMCA at the time, and there came a point where they said, okay, they were trying to do a library school as Fisk was, and they were saying, okay, well, we're gonna focus on US Black, US Negro, and you all can focus on like global. International Negro. And that's what it became known for. And then even when he goes back to New York, again, Charles Johnson is one of his closest friends. He's still talking and assessing collections on behalf. So Charles Johnson sets up the Race Studies Institute, the Race Relations Institute, right, after Schomburg is back. And even, I think it begins after Schomburg's death, but he was already thinking about it. And he asked Schomburg, could you please send me a list of books? And Schomburg sent him a ton of books to start off that library. And so, yeah, I mean, it was also when the building was erected in 1930, I believe, Schomburg is part of the opening ceremonies for the new building, and he talks about like Negro history throughout the Americas. And he also, for them, wanted to have a room that was separate for just reading, for example. And so we think about the spatial dimensions of libraries that we don't even think about, right? And so he wanted a space whereby the students could just come and leisurely browse the collection that he had assembled there. And so, I mean, that's kind of extraordinary because, again, I talk about how even the spatial aspects, you know, why the Schomburg Center remains a space of liberation for so many of us in Harlem. And to think, no, he's not, you know, I think people think, oh, of course, he's in New York. Like, and I go, okay, now he replicates that in the Jim Crow South. Now let's talk about that, you know, and talk about the challenges, you know.
That's incredible. Let's talk a little bit about his legacy now and the legacy of this institution. I remember going there as a college student. I'm a New Yorker. And when I was in high school, I don't think I ever went. And the first time I went to the Schomburg, it was to see a free concert with Max Roach. The second time I went, I was in college, and it was on a Saturday, and Sonia Sanchez had come up from Temple with about 30 of her students. And I remember talking with her going, it's something that I do every semester to force them to come here and have to deal with the meaning of this place and what it means to research. What does the Schomburg Center mean for you?
So what's interesting is, so I teach at a school that is literally blocks away, right? The City College of New York is on 137th Street. Between Convent and Amsterdam.
Up on the hill.
Up on the hill. So literally, for, you know, when I talk to students, when I talk to colleagues who are specialized in African American lit in particular, they're like, everybody knows the Schomburg. I'm a professor of Spanish and Portuguese. I'm telling you, not everybody knows about the Schomburg. And so for my students, many of my students come from Latin America and the Caribbean, right?
And New Yorkers, right? They're native New Yorkers.
They're native New Yorkers.
Right, or living in New York.
You know, many of them first generation college students,
right.
Many working class students. So when I tell them about this library, I go, okay, but I do it in the context of the way I teach Latin America is with a focus on Blackness. Like I center Blackness there. So
right.
Off top, I'm challenging what they know, right? And I go, oh yeah, and by the way, we're gonna go to this library that was founded by, and I want to be clear about, Schomburg was also, you know, he was also Danish West Indian, right? He was born in Puerto Rico. His mother was from St. Croix and St. Thomas, and so I don't want anybody to be like, well, what about his mama? Right? Like, this is true. Like he was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Cangrejos, which is now Santurce, but that was a free Black community.
Right.
So his mother was a migrant worker from the surrounding islands who come, and her family is in then the Danish West Indies and comes to Puerto Rico. So that's really important. I want to be really clear on that. So come to this place that's founded by this man, this Caribbean man, and then I start questioning them, what do you think? When I say Black, what do you think? And so for them, you know, there is well, there's US Black, or there's like, no, yo soy negro, yo soy negra. Okay, now here's an archive. What's an archive, right? What is this collection of these papers, these prints, everything that the Schomburg is? And then we go and we explore, you know, because many of them do know, for example, who James Baldwin is, but they don't know that that space also has prints about Peru and Mexico and Brazil and all of everything else. So when we say global Black experience,
That's
global Black experience.
Yeah.
And so that's what it means for me personally. It is the most rich place. And even, you know, I quote Jean Blackwell Hudson at one point, who said, you know, Mr. Schomburg might have been a little bit naive because he really thought that just by demonstrating.
And she was one of the librarians at the space after he had passed on.
Yeah, she becomes the second director after Lawrence Reddick
of the Schomburg,
of the Schomburg Center. Well, she becomes the first director when it's declared the Schomburg Center before Howard Dodson.
Right.
And so she said, you know, he wasn't thinking about preservation. He was thinking collection, and then the way to combat white supremacy was to demonstrate Black excellence.
Right.
And so he
thought he was naive about
yeah, because he thought, okay, well, racism will end
right.
if I show you the evidence.
Right. And that was
of
really
it.
a Harlem Renaissance ethos. The idea if we showed the best of ourselves to white folks, they'd be like, oh, okay.
Right, exactly. And so she's like, yeah, not so much. And so we know, of course, that white supremacy does what it does and twists and turns. But in terms of what it still does, not only for anybody of African descent, what that place still does is it does validate you in a way that perhaps mainstream public discourse does not.
Yeah.
And so whether you're English speaking, French speaking, German speaking, Spanish speaking, Portuguese speaking, doesn't matter. You will find something about the country of your origin in that space. And that's the value of it.
What do you think he would say if he saw the Schomburg Center today?
My God, I think he would be astounded. He would be astounded by it because, you know, of course it's expanded since that room. Right. You know, I mean, John Henrik Clarke talks about when he was a child that he went to the 135th Street branch and went upstairs.
Right.
And so Schomburg's realm was like a floor.
Right.
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 And so to now see that it commands the whole block, to now see that it is literally 135th to 136th Street, that it's, you know, I believe 4 floors, it's offices, it has more than 10 million documents and prints and film and I think he would just be astounded by it.
You've been watching Left of Black. We've been joined today by Professor Vanessa Valdés, who's Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the City College of New York. She is the author of the book Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.